Drug overdose deaths per capita have nearly doubled in Washington over the past 2 years. Overdoses for methamphetamine and fentanyl account for most of the deaths. So what is Washington doing to address this epidemic, and what more can be done? Joining me now are two state lawmakers who are on the front lines of this issue. Democratic State Representative Lauren Davis, who is also Executive Director of the Washington Recovery Alliance, and Republican State Representative Dan Griffey, who serves as well as a professional firefighter. Welcome both of you to Inside Olympia. Good to see you. And Representative Davis, I want to start with you. Can you just, in a nutshell, this is a kind of a broad question, but just give us the sort of a sense of where we're coming from and where we're trying to get to, so we have a little bit of context for this conversation.
Sure. So, I mean, the opioid epidemic began in earnest in the early 2000s, and it was raging by the 2010s. And at that time, for most of the 2010s, the state investments in addressing untreated substance use disorder in community have largely been focused on treatment. The issue with that is that treatment is really one leg of a three-legged stool. When we look at the substance use disorder continuum of care, it actually has three component parts. You've got outreach, which is everything that occurs prior to treatment, and then you've got treatment, and then you've got recovery support services, which is the collection of services that help keep people in recovery post-treatment. And because we can bill insurance and get a federal Medicaid match, we've historically invested in treatment and treatment alone. We cannot bill insurance for those outreach services, pre-treatment, or the post-treatment aftercare. What changed radically during last legislative session in response to the State v. Blake decision is we made some significant historic investments in the outreach piece and the recovery support service piece. And so for the first time, we are actually trying to fund the entirety of the substance use disorder continuum of care. It's not sufficient, but those programs are starting in earnest actually now, Q1 of this year, 2022. So we're finally going to start to see the fruits of what happens when you actually fund the entire continuum of care. And I fully expect to see reductions in both untreated addiction and community, but also its various manifestations in terms of visible homelessness, property crime, child welfare involvement, et cetera.
That's the most hopeful note I've heard in a long time, actually, in terms of, seeing visible signs of progress towards addressing these really vexing issues. So Representative Griffey, you have a personal story to tell about addiction, substance use disorder, and how it affects families. And then you also see this in the front lines you're a lieutenant, correct, with the fire department in Mason County. So I'm interested, if to the extent you're willing to share a little bit about how this has touched your family, but also what you've seen on the front lines in your work and how this is manifesting itself.
Well, thank you, Austin, for the question. Both in my day job, my full-time job as a professional firefighter, and as a father, I see substance abuse hit me in the face every day. I have a substance abuse, a substance addicted daughter who has been in and out of homelessness. We continuously fight the state in she'll be in treatment somewhere, and we'll get a letter that she's in treatment. However, we can't have any communication with her. And then she's just released in homelessness. We've actually drove all the way to Vancouver, Washington, just to find her. We found her, we get her situated again. She falls back into the process, or the lack thereof a system, and kind of is allowed, again, I think a mistake, allowed by the state to continue to circle out of control. As a firefighter, I see the same thing every day. I see the failure points in our mental health and substance response every day. I was blessed to meet with the good Representative Lauren Davis, who has ideas how to fix it. And I think all too often in Olympia, we are too remote from the problem. As a frontline firefighter, I can totally support Lauren and what she's doing, most of what she's doing. Obviously, we have some disagreements, but we agree on the problem. We agree on what the solution could look like. Now's the time not to, in Olympia, we kind of transfer our problems to others. the fire department will take care of it, or the law enforcement will take care of it. We kind of put the cart before the horse and forget that there's so many other processes that has to be in effect or take effect for us to have a robust and functioning system to deal with substance abuse. It's tragic, but I'm here to work with the good representative to see if we can finally get some momentum or progress on this.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing your personal story. I mean, obviously, you're not obliged to do that, so thank you for doing that. And you know, a lot of families, fortunately, can share similar stories in this state and across this country. The opioid crisis has cut across all manner of families and socioeconomic lines. It's everywhere. So, Representative Davis, one of the things that I think people are trying to understand is you mentioned the Blake decision, which was the Supreme Court saying that the state's simple drug possession law was unconstitutional as currently structured. And the legislature, Democrats in the legislature, have used that as an opportunity to say, well, maybe we should just rethink the idea of criminalizing drugs, incarcerating people for drugs, and really focus more on treatment. And you've suggested that this did provide a bit of an opening for now funding the pre and post services. But one of the things that I keep hearing, and I really am interested in your thoughts on, and Representative Griffey's, is this idea that you got to be able to force people or require people to accept help or treatment, and that right now what's happening is we're not prosecuting and we're sort of referring people and saying treatment is available. What are your thoughts on what the state's approach, how to get people the help if it's now going to be available?
Terrific question, Austin. So the reality is that it's accurate that there are individuals for whom compulsory treatment may be the only avenue into care, but that is the minority narrative. That is a small portion of the population, but an important portion, and I'll address that briefly. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact we have significant data that over 80%, 90% in some cases of individuals in active addiction with untreated substance use disorder are yearning for help, are yearning for care. They are absolutely miserable, devastated by their life circumstances, and 11% of those individuals received help. So what the 5476, the state's response to the Blake decision, really looked at addressing the 80 to 90% of folks who, if they just had a person reach out and treat them as a person of dignity and worth and forge a human connection. And, you know, the effective intervention is really engagement and building that meaningful relationship. And from there, hope grows, and from there, recovery grows. So the investments that we made last year are really about focusing on the super majority of folks who actually would access care if only they were given a roadmap and a guide to help them through that process. Now, to talk about the other 10 to 20%, that's a very real percentage of the population. And those folks fall into sort of two camps. Some of those folks have a co-occurring serious mental illness, and the substance use disorder is really secondary. It's sort of a byproduct of the serious mental illness, but the serious mental illness is what is preventing them from engaging in care. Many of those folks have something called anosognosia, which essentially it's Latin for lack of insight. It means they essentially don't know they're sick. It's part of the symptoms of their disease. And then you have the other portion of folks who just have extremely severe substance use disorder. And my best friend, Ricky, the namesake of Ricky's Law, fell into that category. People who are so deep in their addiction that they're so hopeless, they have no hope they'll ever recover, and they don't even think they're worthy of recovery. And they too need some support seeking treatment and may not do that volitionally. And for those people, we have Ricky's Law, which is the state's civil commitment for substance use disorder. We are making huge strides this very legislative session with House Bill 1773 for something called assisted outpatient treatment, which is compulsory outpatient treatment, which the legislature originally passed a number of years ago, and it's basically not utilized at all. And this bill would actually make it functional and make it possible for families to get folks into compulsory substance use and mental health treatment on an outpatient basis to start. And if that fails, on an inpatient basis. The important part is that all of that is civil proceedings. It's in civil court. It is not a criminal matter, because these are treatable brain diseases from which people recover. They're not a criminal condition. But yes, there are some folks who need some additional support. And for that, we have civil commitment.
Okay. Representative Griffey, you said in the case of your daughter that she sort of dropped through the cracks here, that every time she might get into treatment and comes out, then she's essentially just dropped off. To what extent do you feel like the funding from last year to get that pre and post treatment kind of continuum of care, and then things like assisted outpatient treatment, are the kinds of answers that are needed? Is there something missing here?
Well, I do think there is something missing. The majority party, Austin, I think has a big heart in this process, but the Blake decision has let a lot more people fall through the cracks. And the way that the mechanism that it has done that is law enforcement has the obligation to enforce laws in Washington State. If somebody's not committing a criminal or civil act, they don't have an ability to interact with that person. And I think we've seen while I agree with Lauren that we're going the right direction, we've seen, a major backward slide. This last year as a professional firefighter, not having law enforcement help on violent calls made us, as in the fire service, first responders, it made us take second, third, fourth looks at, well, are we actually going to go in and try to save that person that has a knife and who's threatening suicide, or the person who is overdosed on a drug? We have to understand that force is used sometimes to save people, and I think we're getting there. The compulsory use of, or the bills addressing use of force. I many times have actually tackled somebody who was, naked from the waist down in the middle of a 4-lane highway, and then just physically drug them off the, side of the road. So again, I think sometimes there is a big disconnect between Olympia and the actual boots on the ground sort of experiences. And I want to help break through that. I want to help the good representative identify those issues that, use of force does save people. Sometimes when we put people in jail for a minor crime that they committed because they're addicted to substance, it saved them that night. They weren't on the street any longer. Until we build the robust program that we have to have that has adequate amounts of treatment. So me as a first responder, I can take somebody right to a treatment zone. We need to have that stopgap. So yes, I think there is somewhat of a disconnect right now with the new laws and the new rules. We can't deploy them because it's not an illegal act right now. I think there is something there's a lot of things we can do, but we have to respect that.
Well, and there's so many, this could get really complicated really quickly because there have been a lot of changes, obviously, in police use of force rules of the road, some of which are being changed or amended even as we speak. And then, of course, the Blake decision has longer term implications that the legislature hasn't made kind of final decisions about. And Representative Davis, I know that there's a distinction between drug legalization and decriminalization, and that's a whole other conversation. But I do want to ask you to respond to this idea that I've heard from Representative Griffey now and others in the past, which is sometimes the best thing to get somebody into treatment is to put them in a jail cell first, because they have, either it gets them off the street for a moment and then they're in a place where they can think about this, or they have kind of an aha moment of this isn't ever, I didn't want to end up here, so now I want help. Is there any, from your experience, is there any truth to that idea?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Austin. That does happen on occasion. So I work in addiction recovery for a living outside the legislature. This has been my life's work for a decade. And I do have a handful of friends who will say things like, jail saved my life. That is true. I won't deny that. But that is a really excessively small minority of folks. So to give you some data, of the individuals who were arrested in a given year in Washington State prior to the Blake decision for simple possession of drugs, only 3% of those individuals ever ended up in drug court. So for 3%, the recovery, that might have been an arc of recovery story. But for 97% of those individuals, let me tell you what happened to them. So addiction is a disease of self-loathing. Nobody hates that person more than the person themselves. There is, and so when you actually add on additional pain for this individual, all that really does is increase their separation from society, their feelings of worthlessness, their feelings of hopelessness, their sense of being other or less than, and it actually increases their reasons for using. One of the diagnostic criteria for substance use disorder is continued use despite negative consequences. So it is positively illogical, given everything we know about the brain disease of addiction, to suggest that additional negative consequences, such as incarceration, are going to facilitate behavior change. It does happen in a very small minority of cases, but for most people, it increases their reasons for using. Incarceration disrupts any positive progress they might have in terms of family relationship, employment, capacity to pay rent. And then prior to the Blake decision, then they cop a felony charge. And what does a felony charge do? It prohibits employment and it prohibits housing. And housing and employment are two of the most important tenets of long-term recovery, and statistically highly correlated with long-term recovery. So that this notion that we took away some wildly effective tool is just a fallacy. That was never the story. The overwhelming majority of these folks were there. The hole was dug even deeper when we incarcerated them, and we punished them for having a chronic treatable disease. And I say all that with the caveat that, some respectful disagreement with my dear colleague, but there are very few lawmakers who are as gifted and have as big of a heart as Rep. Griffey. So it's an honor to serve with him. And I know we have some disagreement on this, but we agree much more than we disagree.
Well, I think this is a nice way to transition to kind of what the legislature is and can do in a short session, and what the future might look like, because you've established that some money has been put in. It's not enough. But Representative Griffey, when the balance of time in this interview segment, but also in this session, is there a particular bill, a particular funding piece, something that you think could start to make a difference out on the streets, in the context, or in families, as you've experienced this so personally?
Well, Austin, I really believe the good gentle lady's comments are pure and true. Her bills that she's running right now and the bills that we're running, I think, can make a difference. But again, Austin, while we're building this system, people like me have almost no resources to get people into. I schedule ALS transports. And I schedule BLS transports, basic life support transports. We constantly are looking all over the state to find some sort of resource. And right now, if we don't get them into a facility, what do they do? They put them on the street. And on the street, they right now are getting into fentanyl and those sort of things. We have an epidemic with regard to fentanyl. So I agree with the good gentle lady that there shouldn't be long-term stigmas because you committed a crime due to your substance abuse disorder. I agree with her that it is negative, but I disagree that at this point in time that we actually have adequate resources. I live in rural Mason County and I work in rural Mason County. We do not have adequate resources. So to say that we're going to save people and not have anywhere to take them, I think is not. It's not a very good process. Again, the Olympia put the cart before the horse. I think where we're going is going to save people and it's going to be robust and amazing. But until we have those brick and mortar places where we can actually drop people off to keep them safe and get their treatment started, people are still going to there's going to be a lot of tears shed. And the first responders need to have resources. And if we had resources, we will save people's lives. We just don't have enough yet.
Well, and Representative Davis, this gets back to something that was a theme in the last conversation in the first panel about homelessness, matching the scope of the problem, the response to the scope of the problem. So can you give us some sense of how much money was put into this in the budget last year, and kind of what you think, what that will do, and then what's the gap that's left?
Sure, that's a terrific question. So we put into this kind of flagship Recovery Navigator program in the Senate Bill 5476 from last year. We funded that at $45 million statewide, and that's just the outreach component. So that's all the suite of outreach and engagement pre-treatment services for folks. And I'd be lying if I told you I had a number, because again, that those services are just coming online in community in every single region of the state, including and especially our rural areas. Those services will come online this month in February and next month in March. So we are only going to begin to see what the kind of service gaps might be for different geographies, different suburban and urban areas that are more densely populated. So I don't know. I do know the answer is more, but we don't really know how to quantify that yet. But I also want to note that there were a number of other investments in behavioral health the legislature made that serve a very similar population, lots of Venn diagram overlap. And one of those was the huge mammoth investment in 988, the state's behavioral health emergency line. That comes online in July. And when I think about Rep. Griffey and his incredible work in the fire service and the people he sees every day, he's generally encountering people because they're in crisis, either an acute mental health crisis or substance use disorder crisis or both. And part of 988 involves creating a huge amount of crisis receiving facilities in communities. I'm helping to build one in my district right now in Linwood, and it's for first responders to be able to bring people who are in crisis. We don't have those right now. Right now, we have two choices: jail or an emergency department, neither of which are an appropriate place for somebody in a psychiatric or substance use emergency. And then they don't get the proper care. They don't get the proper follow-up treatment. So I couldn't agree with him more. We need more on the operating side, and we also need a significant infusion of capital dollars. I will say the governor's supplemental budget included $60 million in capital money for these type of crisis receiving facilities that I described. And I do hope the legislature will fund at least that level, because Rep. Griffey is absolutely right about the need for more services.
And what about his criticism that in the meantime, the legislature's gotten the cart before the horse in terms of, with respect to people caught with drugs, the police now, saying, I can refer you to treatment, but initially, at least, we're not going to arrest, we're not going to prosecute.
Sure. I mean, as somebody who's
dedicated, and I just want to be clear, I know you explained why a jail cell isn't, the answer for most people, but the question is, in the meantime, until we can stand up this system you're describing, have we not sort of shot ourselves in the foot here?
Yeah, my short answer would be we shouldn't have to hurt people to help them. If I've, dedicated much of my adult life to trying to serve people. I have just an enormous amount of compassion within me, and a desire and a belief that all people are capable of recovery. And if I believed that it were effective, that handcuffing someone and putting them in a cage and telling them that they're bad, if I thought that were effective, by golly, I would probably advocate for it myself, but it's just not. And we're just hurting people, we're harming people, and we're shaming them. And this is a shame-based disease. So when you amplify shame, you amplify drug use. So I would offer that we didn't take away anything that was working. And again, some of the investments that we're making this year, particularly around this assisted outpatient treatment, can actually make an extraordinary difference. We are going to allow emergency department physicians, mental health professionals, substance use disorder professionals to petition for these assisted outpatient treatment orders. That's never been possible in Washington state. We've allowed only one type of profession, designated crisis responders, to do these petitions. And so it's totally underutilized. And the petitions are only 90 days. Under the bill I described, they will be 18 months of involuntary care that can include inpatient treatment when necessary. So I really do think the population that we're describing, people who are really suffering, and everybody knows it, that AOT investment will really help as well.
Just a couple minutes left. Representative Griffey, do you think that assisted outpatient treatment bill could be a game changer in your family's life?
Well, I hope so, Austin. I think in my family's case, the state needs to understand that we need to reduce the criteria for civil commitment. And I think we get it wrong. And I think Lauren and we've talked about it 100 times. We agree on that. But, to answer what she was just saying, yeah, jail's the wrong place for them. It really is. But boots on the ground, first responders that have to do this day in, day out, we have no resources. And we have like 8 more, 10 more, 20 more calls backed up that we have to get to, real people in crises. We need to see something now. We need to be able to take somebody in crisis to a center and it's got to be close. We can't drive our ambulance from Shelton, Washington to Vancouver. We've got to have in-community treatment. We've got to have places to drop them off. And I really believe we have to have the resources. Let's face it, Austin, some of these people in crisis do very violent things. They could injure people, and a lot of times we interact with them because they did injure someone. So they are a danger to themselves and others. And in that case, they need to have be isolated from society for a short period of time till we can make sure they're safe. And so I think that I want to have the world that Lauren wants to live in with this. I want to be there, and I want to get there sooner rather than later. But I want us to be real when we talk about they are actually hurting people and themselves. And so the reason society incarcerates people is to protect them, protect society from the actions that they do. If we can stop those actions, I think we can have great success.
Okay. I have less than a minute left. Representative Davis, a final quick thought.
Final quick thought is thanks for having us. Thanks for the conversation. One of the best things we can do is to talk about this issue and to talk about the fact how many families that this impacts, and just big thanks to my colleague, to Rep. Griffey. This is an extremely bipartisan issue, and I cherish that. And we all see the problem, and we all want to do right by this population, and we're committed to doing it. And for that, I'm filled with a lot of hope, because recovery is not only possible but probable when we provide people access to adequate resources.
Okay, Representatives Lauren Davis and Dan Griffey, thanks very much. We do appreciate the conversation. It's an important one to have. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.